This is a lecture on global models of land governance. What we're going to go over here is how relationships between humans and the land are defined in different countries. It's really easy, for instance, having grown up in the United States, to think about ownership of land and rights to land in a very particular way that's in some ways specific to our country. Given that we live in a global community and natural resources are managed across the globe, it is important to learn and understand how governance works in different parts of the world. So let's start with some definitions. So governance is the institutional framework or system that sets the rules about how natural resources are managed and how land is owned and who has rights to land. These systems of governance vary from country to country. They can vary from really strict and well-established and sort of something you can rely on, which for the most part is how governance works in the United States or Canada. Whereas there are some countries where governance structures are non-existent. They're essentially failed governments, or they're extremely corrupt and really don't serve the people in any meaningful way. So there's lots of variation in governance systems across the globe. Here's an example of part of the governance system for public land and natural resources in the United States. So we've talked about this when we talked about land ownership and stewardship in the federal government sector. This is part of the legislative branch of the U.S. government, and this shows, for instance, different cabinet level sections of the executive branch. So this is the Department of the Interior, headed by the Secretary of Interior, and different government land management agencies under the Interior: BLM, Fish and Wildlife, National Park System, Bureau of Indian Affairs. Here is Secretary of Agriculture, the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We talked about how the Forest Service is the one big land management agency that's under agriculture and not Interior. Right now, the chief of the U.S. Forest Service is Randy Moore. So, clearly very, very well-defined, well-established system of governance in the United States. We're not the only ones. This is an example of part of the governance system in Belize. An org chart looks a lot like that for the U.S. This is written down, and enshrined in law in Belize. Different ministries over different parts of public lands and natural resources. This person, Omar Figueroa, is actually a UF graduate. He got his PhD from the Wildlife Ecology and Conservation Department in 2013, and he's the head of this government ministry over forestry and fisheries. So, again, well-defined governance system, but we can't necessarily assume that that's the case in all countries. Land tenure is another important concept in this whole idea of relationships of people to land. Land tenure, maybe broadly defined, is the rights of people or communities to manage and use land that they often reside on. And this can happen in a couple of senses. So, for instance, in the United States, if you rent or lease land, or you have certain rights to that land, even though you don't own it. So if you're a renter, you have the right to live on that property, and you have a right to say that certain people can come into your house or not, including sometimes the owner. So that's one example of land tenure rights, where you have some rights to land that aren't necessarily there because you own it. So in that case, the owner granted some of those rights to the land to you. So that's one meaning of land tenure. Another meaning of land tenure might be, for instance, when indigenous people have lived on land sometimes for generations and decades, centuries, and maybe even millennia, but don't have formal government title to that land. Yet they've lived there, inhabited there, maybe farmed, hunted on that land into perpetual memory. They have land tenure, but the status of their relationship to the land can sometimes be in dispute or complicated. So very often indigenous people and their land tenure is an important problem that needs to be solved by governments, and it isn't always solved satisfactorily. So it's important to remember that land tenure has both legal attributes, but also traditional, cultural, socio-political attributes and definitions as well. Land tenure is another one of those topics that you can take entire courses on. And then there's land ownership. Land ownership means the legal rights over land within a system of governance. So this usually involves titling. So you have to establish title within a system of governance to own a piece of property. So ownership in most systems of governance conveys sort of maximum rights over a piece of property, although those rights are not absolute. So for instance, in the United States, ownership only involves surface natural resources. So even though you may own a piece of property, you generally don't own, for instance, the mineral rights to that land. Someone else can own the mineral rights to that property. Similarly, that ownership is not absolute in that you cannot do absolutely anything you want to your land. Usually within some system of governance, there are limits to what you can do to your property. You can't dump toxic waste on your property. Within a city, there are limits to what you can build on a piece of property relative to zoning laws. So there are all sorts of legal, regulatory, and statutory limits on the rights, even of ownership, within any particular system of governance. So what should be becoming clear is that land ownership can be a complicated concept. Again, I think in the United States, it feels like a very straightforward concept. You can go out, get a realtor, purchase a piece of property, you have the title in hand, and you own that land. But again, it's not so straightforward everywhere. And for instance, that wasn't necessarily straightforward when Europeans arrived in North America. There were people living here, as we know. There were indigenous people living on this property, and they technically had tenure to that property. And when, for instance, if you remember the story, I heard the story when I was in elementary school of, Europeans buying the island of Manhattan from native peoples with a chest full of beads and baubles. That may or may not be exactly what happened, but if nothing else, it's a demonstrative story that demonstrates that different cultures have different concepts of land tenure and land title. And I think what that story illustrates is that the Europeans had very specific ideas of land ownership that the natives, the indigenous people of Manhattan in that example, didn't. They said, hey, yeah, we're happy to take this chest of beads and baubles. We really don't know what the heck you're talking about with regard to ownership. Native people's relationships with land was very different than Europeans' relationships with land. And in many cases, obviously, that ended up working counter to the benefit of those indigenous people. But at any rate, we have a system of governance now in the United States that has made that at least well enshrined in law, and most of us understand it, even though it had a lot of collateral damage in establishing that. There are places in the world where that idea of indigenous tenure versus indigenous title is still in dispute. So other countries are still going through that process with their native peoples that we went through in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And that can be difficult and involve lots of bureaucratic hurdles. So there are examples of, for instance, in Peru, where there were indigenous people living in the Peruvian Amazon, and it took a lot of time, a lot of conflict, basically warfare, and a lot of bureaucracy for those indigenous peoples to obtain title to their land where they essentially already had tenure. So that's, a very complicated situation. And I suppose those indigenous people, even though it was violent, were lucky that they were able to sort of overcome those bureaucratic hurdles and obtain title to that land. And there are situations where, for instance, logging or mining companies can get concessions to land where native people may have tenure, but the government may grant access to, for instance, logging or mining companies without any permission from native people that are already living there. So these relationships can be very fraught and complicated. And again, a reminder that these situations vary all over the world. This is a map of places in the world where land tenure and property rights and land ownership is in dispute. So you can see in much of the world, there are not well-established and settled agreement on property rights and tenure, especially with regard to indigenous people. So this is still very much at play in different parts of the world. These are just some examples of different facets where ownership and tenure or uncertainties related to ownership and tenure can cause problems. So for instance, land tenure issues and conflict have played a major role in many conflicts in Africa since 1990. Gender can be really important. So in many parts of the world, women don't or can't obtain tenure or ownership of land, and that can lead to problems. For instance, if a woman is widowed and has a family to support, if governance systems don't allow her to own land, that's a big problem. In Ethiopia, food insecurity can be decreased by allowing women to have land ownership or land tenure. Land rights and land tenure can also play important roles in forestry. So in the developing world where there's insecure tenure, that can also often lead to deforestation, because where ownership is uncertain, basically everything is up for grabs. And land can be deforested and land use can be changed sort of without any oversight, because those models of governance and land tenure and ownership are not well established. So poor management often derives from situations where land tenure is uncertain. Land tenure and land rights can also have implications for instance, response to climate change.